All right, we're back. I know we threw you off. We given everybody 30-minute breaks up until now, but for this we're shifting to a 15-minute break. It's been a long day of doing intellectual work in the Afrofuturism conference during the Hurston Festival. But I do like to point out that the festival has a long history of encouraging teaching and learning connected to the arts and humanities. And so it's fitting for this first day of the conference that we finish up on a roundtable. I'm taking the opportunity here to bring back our presenters, all of which do a lot of teaching. We're all professors. And so I wanted to have a little discussion about the work of teaching and learning around these questions of the speculative and around these questions of popular culture in particular. I think we all teach classes. I know I teach a class that's about Afrofuturism. We all teach on pop culture subjects, and that intersects with the broader sort of global conversations about identity and about power and so on and so forth. So I'm just taking an opportunity here to bring together some people who are thinking and teaching about this, to have a conversation about this. My first question for folks is, what is the value from your perspective as someone who's teaching? How is the question of teaching about culture, especially the perspective that you're teaching from it, what is the value for your students? And I think all of us are teaching undergraduate students about these ideas. And so I'm gonna start there. Like, what do you see as the value of teaching these subjects to your students? And I'll start with Vidhu because she's right next to me, but I'll get to you guys on the Zoom. But go, Vidhu. How would you answer that question? What is the value of teaching these subjects?
Well, I mean, one thing is, I'm going to leave this conference and go to my transnational futures class, right
It's
afterwards.
Like I planted her.
Yes, and I feel like, whoa, there's some new stuff I can teach just by coming to this conference and seeing Tamar's work and hearing from Qiana. It's interesting because so I'm going to be talking today about some of the differences between the sort of controversy around Afrofuturisms and African futurisms, for instance. And then eventually we go into different other futurisms, right? Like Asian futurisms. But I feel like one thing is that, and I teach other classes like post-colonial lit. I've taught other classes before, but I feel like there's a way in which looking at the intersections of technology, what does this mean in terms of what is emerging out of the present and unfolding into the future, is a question that's very interesting to students. So it's a way in for young people into questions of nation, race, fantasy, and I think it's really effective. I mean, can I just say that it's effective in that sense? Because so for instance, some of the stories, one of the stories that we're reading for today is N.K. Jemison's Too Many Yesterdays, Not Enough Tomorrows, okay? And this is a story about this woman who's in a bubble world after this, this sort of weird thing happens with the world where everyone's in a separate bubble and they can only communicate via these computers. And every day is a repetition of the previous day. Okay, and I've been teaching this for a while, but under the pandemic conditions, this story is really resonant in a different way. It's not that these stories that are futuristic are imagining just the future, they're speaking to our potential presence. And it's speaking of that present from the perspective of the character Helen is African-American and she is living in Japan. And so you get this sort of transnational subject of a Black American in Japan in a bubble, talking to all of these other people across cyberspace. And so it's an experience that people can really identify with to begin with. I mean, before they can start tackling all the other issues around race, class, gender, sexuality, nation. So that's one thing that I would say on a basic level.
Qiana, how would you answer that question? And what's the value of teaching this this material to undergraduates?
Well, I would say,
Oh, you're muted, or we can't hear you.
oh no. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. So I've not had the opportunity to teach a full course, for instance, on Afrofuturism literature, art or literature, but I often work a unit of it into courses that I do on surveys of African American studies that are focused on art and culture. And I also teach a course on postmodern Black literature and culture, in which I include a unit on speculative fiction and futures and so forth. And so I think in that context, sort of couched within a larger class, these readings and other forms of media and art becomes, it's interesting, even if they're dystopian texts, and some of them are, we look at like the space traders and things of that nature. Even if they're dystopian, there's still a way in which, after reading about struggle and African American culture and history and different representations, there's a kind of potentiality. There's in imagining the future and talking about different technologies and ways of knowing. There's joy, there's creativity, and it is, I fully agree, it's a sort of, it is an effective teaching tool, but also another way of offering a different kind of framework for thinking about these concepts that we may have studied in other sections of the course. So.
Okay,
that's what I
Tamar.
got.
Thanks. I think for me, it's really about the exposure of, I hate this, I don't really like this term, but quote unquote minor literatures to students, right? Because even just, for example, experiencing a reading or looking at, let's say, a different kind of non-Latin alphabet like Armenian or Greek, right, becomes a way that students could engage with or imagine like a decolonized kind of curriculum or pedagogy, which doesn't preference kind of the canonical literatures that they're used to or exposed to. So for me, I kind of think about representation as a question. So when I ask you to think about how people are represented, and then you think about your own kind of experience of how you're represented, sometimes I feel that those are the ways in which undergrad students start connecting to different kinds of literatures or narratives. And there's a lot of literature in Armenian or Arabic and so on that isn't translated. So I am of the mindset that it is important to include literature, even if it's in translation, as long as you could frame it for a student, because I see the benefit of reading that literature, even if it's not the best translation, as a way of being exposed and entering into a cultural experience that then could be compared or then could be analyzed within a larger framework. So that's some of the ways that I approach it. I also really think and talk about language and subjectivity, and the way that we think about the position of subjectivity within a larger kind of post-colonial framework, or how we think about the idea of the language of interaction between European languages and non-European languages, and how that's affected the way we think about ourselves within the history of our past and where we are in America, right? Or in the world. So, yeah.
I think one of the questions, or one of the hopes that we often, I think historically connect to the humanities, is there the ability of the writing, the art, the literature, that humane work to create a context whereby people learn or can feel, can empathize with the narrative they're being presented with. And I wonder, as people who are thinking about writing about, sort of like living this work, are there moments where you can see the kind of sort of transformative empathetic impact that we hope for in the context of some of the things, can you give me an example of the kind of empathy building connected to these experiences? And I'll start with Qiana, because she teaches comics, I teach comics. And I do feel sometimes when I teach a comics class that students will read a comic and go, I understand something, which I often don't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily have thought they would get it from that, but I'm like, no, it's crystal clear to me. I'm like, oh, okay. That's always great. So I'll start with you, because I know you teach comics.
Yeah, the example I actually was going to give was not from a comic, but sorry, but I do teach
It's okay,
comics.
it's okay.
I mean, when you're thinking about the question of empathy and the role that comics play in that, I can't help but think of texts like Nat Turner and March, which are not necessarily, there's some of them, some contain elements of the speculative, but aren't Afrofuturist texts, and are really nice to see students sort of pushed out of their comfort zone in terms of how they read and interpret visual as well as textual narratives, and helps to sort of amplify that empathy. I was also thinking about how much I love to teach Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, not only because of its accessibility, because it's short, but because it sort of taps into this question of what it means to empathize and with something that is difficult to sort of identify with. So the creatures in that text that are with multiple legs and segments, and like a snake or a fish or an insect. So all sorts of things, and dealing with the analogies between, in that text in Bloodchild, between a hierarchical society, and even Butler's Afterword, where she, in many of the editions that are published now, points out that no, she didn't write that story about slavery, but that's how people often want to group it and frame it. I think because that text is it's so hard to want to relate to an insect, that students always come to class when we're reading that text with visceral reactions. They're deeply engaged and involved, and along the way we can raise some of those really important questions that you mentioned. So those would be some of my examples.
Thank you. Tamar, how would you sort of think about this?
I'm also a medievalist. So I teach a course on the medieval Mediterranean, and I take this moment of the capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099, and I have my students look at that same event from three different sources. So from Western European sources and writers who actually were never physically present there, and then from Arabic writers of the Arab world who have like basically just a page to say about a war that happened at that time, and then through the Armenian experience. And I think a lot of my classes try to offer a multiplicity of ways of thinking about, for example, literature and history as moments that become, I guess, sympathetic, as you're saying, but moments that we can question and go back to who writes history, what is the perspective of history, and how we can critically look at the writings of history and historiography, and how that compares to the genre, for example, of poetry or literary studies, right, which imagines or expresses that experience or that moment in different ways. So I think about genre a lot as a way of also thinking about the human experience. So that's something that also I try to bring back to my students, and to the question of the human and the representations of humanity. And if we take, for example, the European outlook of the Orient or the East, right? And then people like Armenians, where do they fit in? Why do we need to fit them in, right? And to like think about how the trajectory of the epistemology of learning, right, can be challenged through not only the text that we read, right, but through the way that we interpret these very texts by understanding who the writers were and what perhaps, like, for example, with the Crusaders, like their agenda was. So that's one example. The other one you know about, because you and I have talked in length about, which is I teach a class on outlaw heroes and on Robin Hood. And one of the first things I start with is saying that Robin Hood and the outlaw hero is not only a British figure, right? So that allows me to rethink the ways in which, for example, symbolic figures like Robin Hood have become almost, if I may use the term, usurped, right? Kind of in a Western sphere, and how we can think about the outlaw and the genre of an outlaw, not only as a gendered male figure, right? But through the history of outlawry, through transgressions, right? Through transgender characters, what the role of outlawry has played within multiple and various cultures around the world. So we trace the figure of this outlaw from the Americas to Africa to South America, and through Armenia, and think about why this becomes more of a metaphorical and symbolic figure, rather than a person that needs to be kind of pointed in history belonging to one particular culture. So those are some of the ways I think about kind of connectivity and intercultural exchange. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Vidhu?
So yeah, so I'm just doing this right now. So maybe one of the interesting things is I start off having the students read in this transnational features and fantasy class Ngugi from Global Eclectics. And these essays about abolishing the English department, right? Like he talked about abolishing, the English department. And he also has this essay, they read two essays, the one about abolishing the English department, the fact that English became the dominant language in Kenya when he was learning. So they wanted to include a sort of curriculum that reflected the languages and the cultures of the people there. So, there was this sort of discussion around orature and different modes of oral, histories and writing. But also, so there's that. And what would it mean for us to abolish the English department? Should we have English being the sort of main mode of, are we really learning English here? Like, what are we learning? And then I also talked to them about the distinction that he makes in terms of this sort of binary between the oral and the written. And so what is considered to be not only English, but good English? What is the written word still, does it have this cachet and power and authority? And like you have to write this critical essay, for instance, in a particular type of English. Is there other ways that we could write this? And so some of the texts that they read in the class are ones like by Canon Brathwaite and Nalo Hopkinson, in which you have other Englishes along with other languages in translation, right? Like these ideas of how we can, and I actually allow them as writers to like have these, these journals, these responses they do in which they can experiment themselves with other modes of English or of language and, that are specific to their cultural experience. So for me, in order to decolonize the class, you have to really have them think about their own experience with language. And so partly that's where I start off, and it might make them more empathetic to the choices that other writers have made. Like they were just, actually, some of them were shocked that, well, you mean they didn't learn anything in their own language, in their own languages? And people are really shocked by that. And they feel like, and I go, but what about the language that, what about your own language? Did you grow up writing papers in, critical academic language, so it's a way of connecting to them, to these problems that are endemic even to the academy right now and to the discipline as it stands.
I think one of the things that we're mindful of in the context of thinking through the academic narrative for the conference. Of course, we're always borrowing, I think of myself as always borrowing from the legacy of the previous generation, and the example of Zora Neale Hurston, like she wrote about Black language, for instance.
Mhm.
And that's part of the reason why these dialogues about different futurisms, I think, often have to hinge on questions of language, because language encodes knowledge and language encodes power, right? And there's an oddity here in the sense that Zora Neale Hurston is part of the canon. And you know, when we're teaching about the curriculum, we're thinking about the curriculum, we're thinking about the classes that students have. If you had your druthers and you could do something about how the curriculum set up, and with an eye towards, perhaps getting an outcome that's more inclusive or more transformative, what would you ask, like, in terms of like changing the approach to the canon? Like, if you could change up how students are arriving at your class, what would you want to see? What would you encourage in terms of like a kind of transformation of the way knowledge is being sort of like divvied out? And again, think about this in the context of the goals often, in terms of like engagement with art and humanities from the legacy of the festival, is around transformation. It's around sort of like recognizing the ways that this has been a space, especially for African Americans, of transformation, of liberation. And I think that, we are in Florida. I was born here. I can say whatever I want. I wasn't born here, but I grew up here. I can say whatever I want about Florida. I grew up in Florida. I live in Michigan now. People literally send me emails about stories they get from Florida and go, "You from Florida?" Like, I can explain it. I can't, but I understand why they send me those emails. Like, they're like, "I don't understand." Well, there's some question about structures, some question about what people have been, what expectations people have before they get to our classrooms. I know I've had conversations with students about big ideas, similar to the ones that we talked about here. Some of them are really disrupted by that in a way that can be threatening, it can be upsetting. Some of them are really transformed by it and I get nice notes, but it can go either way. So some of it's about the training that they have. So what would we do if we had a chance to rethink the foundation? Like, what do we need to do earlier on in terms of, thinking about the curriculum, thinking about, teaching people? So how will we answer that question? Not to say that we're going to go out and start marching on the streets saying change the curriculum, but what would we do if we wanted to see something happen that was different? I'm just going to let whoever wants to answer that start. What?
I think
Oh, okay. Well, I don't have the mic. For you. Do we have an extra mic for? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I have to smile when you say that Zora Neale Hurston is a part of the canon, because 40 years ago, she weren't part of the canon. So I'd like to hear at some point, and at some point in your discussion, about how it is that the canon is transformed. I'd like to have you talk a bit about our African-American studies, of Africana studies. Is that truly a part of the canon? Is Afrofuturism a part of the canon? And even while I have the microphone, how do you account for people who are coming out of colleges, elite colleges and universities? How are they so much, how is this kind of conservatism, I don't mean political conservatism, but this kind of ignorance or not intolerance of liberal thought? In other words, liberal education, meaning the expansion of the mind. How did we get to this? And is this just a phenomenon in this country? Take 2 or 3 hours to answer those questions, please.
I do think that your initial question about how did Zora Neale Hurston become part of the canon is kind of the question I'm asking, because it's about how do you remix the curriculum. I would say my answer to how Zora Neale Hurston became part of the canon has to do with, it's kind of accidental, but it's also kind of political. So I would say that, part of the reason Zora Neale Hurston is part of the canon is because Alice Walker, of course, rediscovered and reemphasized Zora Neale Hurston as a writer. And that happened at the intersection of two established narratives. One is a sort of African-American history, culture narrative. One is a sort of feminist literature narrative. And the two came together to give you a figure that is Zora Neale Hurston, who exists, I think, very particularly as a literary figure, right? So she's part of literary theory. Whereas I would argue that description of Zora Neale Hurston is a little bit, well, not a little bit, it's limited, right? Like, one argument you can make about Zora Neale Hurston is that Zora Neale Hurston gets shortchanged as a thinker, like all the time. Like every time people talk about Zora Neale Hurston, they literally shortchange her as like a theorist. So that if you're thinking about her in the context of Afrofuturism, I made this quip before, and I'm sure in some meeting that we've had about this very thing, like Zora Neale Hurston worked for everything, right? Like if you want to do sound, Zora Neale Hurston works. If you want to do visuals, Zora Neale Hurston works. Like you can do everything, she can do it all. And that's a testament to like a theorist on par with a man like W.E. Du Bois, right? Who everyone embraces, but they sort of shortchange Zora Neale Hurston. And that's part because they're not looking at the totality of her work because she's defined as a literary figure. And in particular, a literary figure that is being used to justify a very particular narrative around Black culture, I would argue. That's just my answer. I'm not answering anybody else, that's just my answer. But I think that's an important one. Like she's under theorized as a theorist. And hopefully one of the things that would be useful for people to understand in the concept of Afrofuturism, if she works in all these places, just like W.E. Du Bois can work in all these places, shouldn't you think of her in the same way you think of W.E. Du Bois? Shouldn't you think about her in the same way? And that's an important, I think, point, because she does deliver across the spectrum of the knowledge ecology of Afrofuturism. So that would be my answer, right? These intersections.
Well, but I also think it's interesting that you bring up Alice Walker's work. And I'm thinking both of the talks that Qiana and Tamar gave, because I feel like in some ways, to change the canon, you have to sort of be looking into the archives and doing this research and bringing that forward. And so that's what a lot of us end up doing, right? Like we're like hunting, like, like we're just hunting. I'm not hunting. That's a horrible metaphor, but nevertheless,
recovering. We're
recovering. I don't know. Like I'm coming up with like bad ways of saying this, but like you're doing this archival work and connecting these different archives, and which is what I think is so fascinating. And one of the things that I was thinking of when Qiana was speaking was like, wait, okay, so does Evans, yeah. Does Evans, is there, there was the work that he was, the second issue, is there anything of it anywhere in some attic that we could find and put out? Do you know what I'm saying? Like that would be like the sort of mystery of the second issue, like, right? Or, that's like an imaginative space for like maybe somebody else could write the second issue, but is there stuff somewhere? And so partly, what does it mean to go through the archives and look for that stuff?
I will say that John Jennings has imagined a second issue of Lion Man, or like he created a whole sort of meta imaginary universe where all Negro comics continue to publish. And he's created covers in different eras for characters like Lion Man, where he's like, oh yeah, this comic book company did publish another issue. Like in fact, it kept publishing. So Lion Man in the 1970s looks, he imagines the character, then like it goes these different iterations. And that's a major part of like, kind of ongoing imaginative work that he's been engaged with. But you're right, like the archive is this huge.
Well, I have to say, and then you also have to make a case for it, right? Like one of the difficulties, I think, at least when I first started teaching, and maybe others can address this, is that everybody was saying, well, this isn't literature. What, the students, were, arguing about that. Like they were saying, well, this isn't Shakespeare, this isn't this isn't that. Where did you get this stuff? So you end up having to make an argument for it in a way and speak with a certain level of authority when you're like initially a young academic. Everyone thinks you're just making stuff up.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Qiana.
Thank you. So I was thinking and nodding to all of the things you were saying, especially about John's work on a second issue of Lion Man. But I love what Vidhu.
Yes. Yeah.
I love what you said about the importance of looking back in the archive in order to sort of imagine places for us in that future, because that's in many ways one of the things that I'm trying to do when you excavate and bring out these stories about Black readers and creators, 40, 50, 60 years ago. In a way, you're noting that they were there, but also as a way to say, and we are here still doing and furthering and continuing that work. One of the things that I talked about in a piece that, an article that I did, where I tried my best to use some of Hurston's work and characteristics of Negro expression, where she talks about the Negro thinks in hieroglyphics. And I love that turn of phrase because she goes on to talk about how for her, Black culture and storytelling is about creating thought pictures, whether you do that through figurative language or other forms of oral expression. That framing allows a place for me to enter into to bring, to Julian's point, Hurston in as a theorist for thinking about race and visual culture, and a longer tradition than just, a few years ago, but much further back. And just to top it all off, when I think of Hurston and her conversation about thought pictures, and I want to bring in graphic narrative, I also think about Toni Morrison and thought pictures and rememory and all of those things. So I like connecting those dots among African-American thinkers and writers, and sort of using their work in the same way, Julian, you talk about we use Du Bois as sort of a framework for ways of seeing and knowing as we go forward. So great, co-sign all that y'all have said.
Tamar, I'm gonna let you jump in here.
I mean, everyone said such wonderful things. Thank you. I think the question of the canon, I'm not sure on that. I think that is a larger discussion, but I think it's interesting to think about the canon and the archive, right? And the way in which the traditionally archives have been created in institutions. So to go back to the archive, and especially if I think about the significance of archiving for cultures that have experienced trauma like Armenians, right? The archive oftentimes becomes a point or a necessity for proving a history that existed, right? And so when you find, let's say, like, you were talking about having to prove to your students, right, that you're serious about your work. I think it's really interesting when the archive becomes a necessary part of teaching or pedagogy, because it promotes or it validates kind of your experience. But I also wonder if we're talking about futurism, right? Where we can use the archive maybe in healthier ways that isn't only about validating, but also about the nuancing of experience, right? And so it's not like, well, this was said, or this fact was written by a letter of some person, or this image, and now if it's problematic, we're taken aback by it. We're like troubled by this, right? But that we could use this as part of like the way in which that cultural history was expressed by others, by ourselves, right? And as a nuanced way of teaching, where we can be more critical about those experiences and those representations. So I think for Armenians, and when I think about it for other cultures too, I think that becomes points of healing and processes in which we can use the archive as also a problematic place, right? As a problematic kind of grouping or creation of why are things archived together? Who decided what was brought together, right? Who created the conception of this material? Even ephemera material is very interesting to think about, right? In connection to social history or literary history or cultural history. So that's something that I think is like something that's developing, I think, too, among thinkers and people that are using the archive as a tool for teaching or for pedagogy or for research. And I think I actually really like that the archive has become also not something that is factual, but more critically kind of viewed, and that there is the room for criticism of the archive itself, right, and what it represents.
Yeah, for sure. We got a question from the audience.
Hi, thank you. Your topic talking about canon and your question kind of made me think about something interesting. I was wondering if you could talk about, particularly as it pertains to how you teach students in undergraduate classes. I'm curious, but do you think sometimes the process of canonization can sort of undermine the value of some of the works that you do? And you use Zora Neale Hurston as an example, and the thing that I'm thinking is, Zora Neale Hurston is definitely canon today and very mainstream, and there's a movie with Halle Berry and stuff, but something that I think sometimes gets lost is back during the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston's, considerable fight against her male critics and, her role in sort of expressing her voice as a woman. And the pushback she received from male critics saying that that was harming the Renaissance. And so back when she wasn't a canon, this is more to sort of the discussion that she generated, which I think gets lost. And when I think about teaching undergraduates about the value of literature today, I always wonder, like, what kind of works or speakers or writers is that currently being done to today, where in the future, maybe 100 years later, maybe they'll be canon. And then maybe some of the more significant parts of their legacy will just be whitewashed in favor of, some sort of mainstream narrative. And you brought up, multiple people started talking about archives, which is a concept I've never thought about before, about how literature is sort of collected for the benefit of people to sort of analyze and look through, but maybe without the sort of hegemony being imposed on it in a way that a canon might do. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how that would work when you're trying to teach undergraduate students how they should learn to value literature either today or tomorrow to like avoid sort of doing that.
I think from my own experience, I do put a lot of emphasis on telling the stories of Zora Neale Hurston when I've taught it in class, especially in the context of the class I teach as a historian, thinking about genre, telling the story of her as a quote unquote outsider in the Harlem Renaissance, in particular because I think the nature of the outsideness speaks to questions of class, speaks to questions of gender, speaks to questions of region. And, the ideological framework that Zora Neale Hurston is offering in the context of the Harlem Renaissance is one that seeks to not, rejects the stigma of Southernness at sort of base level. And that becomes really important because that becomes part of a longer narrative of Southernness or the South being a problem in the United States, ignoring the nature of racialization across the nation. And so the consequences of like a kind of consistent advocacy for Blackness is okay, which is what I would associate with Zora Neale Hurston, becomes more important the more you think about it in the context of the American experience. Like, okay, because Blackness is constructed as negative, and it's constructed as negative through the archive. So when I'm teaching the Afrofuturism class, which I'm teaching right now, we often look at the origin of words. We look at the origin of Black and white, actually. And I force them to read through, this is the Oxford Dictionary definition of white, and this is an Oxford Dictionary definition of black. And we go through that. We come back to it over and over again. Cause like, remember how white everything is good and black everything is bad, you know? And then that becomes a question about discourse related to systems of modernity. And we had this whole discussion about what is modern, and it being a set of particular readings of the archive that favor European frameworks and disfavor or marginalize non-European frameworks, be it Africa, be it Asia, be it everywhere. And so it's like the language, the reading of history, the collection of the archive all become a consequence of the tool for marginalizing people. So for me, when I'm teaching it in class, I'm like, okay, we kind of have to think about these origin points and recognize the ways that you do have figures that are artists, that are writers, who are often very much and deeply entrenched in trying to tell their version, trying to tell their stories about culture, and don't get collected, don't get recognized. I mean, for Afrofuturists, we don't know how Martin Delaney's Blake ends. We got all the installments except the last installment, right? Like we don't know how the story ends, but like, you know, that's a key Afrofuturist text that was serialized in newspapers. And the final chapter, how the revolution goes, we don't know. And if it wasn't for work, probably for, especially, you know, the last 20, 30 years, when you think about the collection of African-American literature about people like Lewis Gates and things like that, we wouldn't have some of these stories. Like these are stories that were lost, but then mined from the archive and published and brought back into public discourse. So for me as a historian, the archive is very important, and getting students into the archives, looking at materials, doing work of making stuff that might fit into the archive so they understand the nature of decision-making that makes the archive, because people are, archivists are humans too, and they're making decisions about value. They're making decisions about what needs to be included, what's excluded. And those values become legacy, and those legacies become the pivot point for whether or not something is recognized or something is not. And so that's a really important set of conversations that we have in classes that I'm teaching, but I love to hear what other people say. Don't make me call on you.
I mean, what's the question? The question's about the
But
archive.
yeah, about the archive. I think the question is about the
The
archive.
questions about the archive. Yeah. And so I just feel like so I
And
think of
teaching
the
students about
archive,
the archive,
right,
yeah.
right. But, you know, when I think of, so I feel like I'm historically, I disidentify with chronology. Maybe that's what I should say. I disidentify with chronology, which doesn't mean, well, all I'm trying to say is that I oftentimes put different texts from different time periods and from different traditions and mediums together.
Okay.
Right. So, so unlike the historian who might like start off at this one point and go forward in time, like I might take something like a film and put it next to a poem, and they'll like, and then they have to do some of the work of excavation. Let's just put it that way. And so I find that really interesting because my idea is to engender some curiosity in terms of like the agency of these students to go back. Well, actually, in order to read this and this next to each other, we kind of need to go back to something. And so that's maybe my method, rather than saying, okay, here's the origin point, but wait, there might be like another point that connects these, and what is that point? And maybe it's a kaleidoscopic point, like, right? Like Julian came up with this kaleidoscopic point.
Long time ago.
A long time ago, yes. Yeah, like what connects like these sort of disparate cultural artifacts and products and things. And I think this is like really what I do with my own work too. So I'm interested in hearing what other people have to say.
Yeah, those other people on Zoom. Qiana.
I have thoughts. I also heard in the question that was asked about Hurston and canonization, sort of the consequences or sort of long-term
Sure.
implications of that act of integration into the so-called canon. I think I remember when I was in grad school, I could totally be making this up, but I feel like there was a study of some kind that said that the average undergraduate student read Their Eyes Were Watching God like 5 times before they graduated, because it had become, it was seen as a success story, right? So from out of print and Alice Walker to now being assigned in every literature and women's studies and African American studies course. And I feel like, so that's wonderful because you're getting the widespread exposure, the interest, larger audiences, but the consequences of that is that some of those complexities and nuances that Tamar was referring to get pared down, and we start to repeat and oversimplify, or to sort of pigeonhole, to your point earlier, Julian, Hurston in a particular category. And I think that's a real question. Now, I don't think that if they were doing that same survey today, they would find that Their Eyes is getting the same kind of attention, though it's sort of a staple. But I suppose I would say there's also a sense of, as instructors, as academics, a kind of mindfulness that is continuing to advocate for all of the different dimensions of, if we're using Hurston, her legacy, for instance, and different components of her work, and making sure that we sort of uplift those as well. This might be a good time. I don't know if y'all mentioned this already, but Isaiah Lavender's book, the one
Afrofuturism Rising.
Yes, that one. Did you talk about that, where he offers a rereading of The End of Their Eyes and sort of reconceptualizes Janie as a shapeshifter, and talks about how Phoebe says how hearing the story made her grow 10 feet higher and all that. And he does an Afrofuturist reading of that book. And I remember reading that and being very excited that it sort of gave me a fresh eyes for playing with that text and looking at it in a new way. And I think you have to do that in order to keep these so-called canonized texts from becoming oversimplified and stale in that way. It's a good book too.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Tamar, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's it's hard to follow that, but no, I think on that point it becomes interesting too with questions of translation, because when you, for example, have let's say a text from Armenian or other languages, or just something exposed in an archive or something that becomes newly surfaced, it's I guess the point I was trying to make is it's important not to have that one text become the model for representation, right? And that's the difficult part with translation, is that when there's very few translations of a particular culture's literature, right, then the same things kind of get reiterated, and they present another kind of history, right, that is not as complex, right, that is not as it becomes like Qiana was saying, like too simplistic sometimes, right, and not nuanced. But and I think that also in the interesting point on chronology and excavation, I think as a medievalist, it's very interesting to think of the term medieval, right? Because it's in the middle of what, like, it's just the chronology is already Western imposed, right? If you think of the Arab world, the medieval is a very different time period, right? And so I like the point about bringing texts alongside each other that chronologically wouldn't align. And so when I teach poetry or poetry composition, you know, I'll have students doing that too, because I want to bring it back to the actual like form and literature, and not like, oh, this is like 5th century, I'm not going to understand it. And sometimes I'll even not tell them who the writer is, and I'll bring in a translation of a text and I'll have them read it, and then they'll be like, oh, is this, and they'll try to align it to someone who's familiar to them. And then it's interesting to talk about, well, why did you choose that individual? Why is it that you chose to, is it because of what you've read? Is it because of the familiarity with a certain type of canon, right? Can we talk about our exposure to different kinds of literatures? So I think it's interesting when students become self-reflective and aware of kind of their own limitations, but also what has been presented to them in pedagogy up to that point. So yeah, I really like that suggestion, and I really like the comments about the chronology, temporality, excavation. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for the comment.
There's a question I want to make sure I ask, because I think it's a question that reflects some broader concerns. I know that for myself, as someone who teaches about, comics, about culture, I often get asked by parents, like, what should I have my kid read? Like, what can I expose them to? And the reason they're asking that has a lot to do with, as an African-American person, an African-American parent, they're looking for information, they're looking for things that are validating. And this sort of is connected, I think, to this question of like canon. It's like, what makes its way into quote unquote the mainstream? It has a lot to do with like gatekeeping and structure and things like that. But I often try to provide, if I get the email, and I do get random emails or questions like, oh, read this comic, or oh, this book is good, or so on and so forth. So for all of you who are thinking about, questions of marginalized groups from different perspectives, for those parents out there who are watching, and again, I'm mindful of the sort of legacy of the festival, where there's a lot of people who come to get access to African-American authors and African-American literature that they sometimes can't seem to find. What would you say that read this, give this to your kids, this resource that gives you a chance to sort of like see yourself in a different way? What are some of the places that you would send people? What are some of the authors you ask them to read? What are some of the experiences that you would say, this is getting at this sort of desire you have to see a more fuller reflection of your experience and culture? Just favorites. There's no wrong answer. I'm gonna do you like students. There's no wrong answer here. Whatever you say is okay. I have faith in your ability to answer this question. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, Lord. Okay. Well, something, what I tell people if they want to have some fiction for kids, because I like this, it's Nnedi Okorafor's science fiction, like, what is it? Akita Witch. Like her stories, they're amazing. And they have these fantastical like CPUs that computers that grow out of plants and things like that. And the characters are like Nigerian American kids or Nigerian kids, and they're amazing. And I love to just read them. So so there's that.
There you go.
Yeah.
See,
See,
totally great.
well, I would just, yes.
All right, Qiana.
Okay, we're talking about recommendations for parents and younger people. I would recommend, if I'm understanding the question, I would recommend Ebony Flowers' Hot Comb, which is an amazing book. It's partially autobiographical, but not fully, about Black women's sort of hair culture and experiences. I mentioned earlier March, also accessible for younger folks. And I'll also put in a plug for Kindred. Y'all get to hear from John tomorrow, but he did the graphic novel along with Damien Duffy adaptation of Kindred, another accessible book for young people and parents. And I would sort of in honor, thinking of today, and not just today, but every day, but it happens to be Holocaust Remembrance Day, I would encourage parents to pick up Mouse, because it's an incredibly important graphic novel. And if you've dipped a toe into comics Twitter in the last 24 hours,
Yes.
you've heard a lot of news about banned and challenged books, of which comics are often at the top of that list. It's shocking and sad to see that Mouse is appearing again on that list after so many years. So those would be the books I would recommend.
Mouse is M-A-U-S.
Correct.
Mouse, yeah. And last but not least, Tamar, if you're gonna like give a recommendation, like random, hey, this, people ask you, what can I give my kids to make them feel better? What can I do to like give them a different?
I have to say this book because it just came out and I want to plug it. But it's a children's story about the author that I mentioned earlier, Zabel Yesayan. It's about the story of her life, and written for a children's book. And it's about being a mother and being a daughter, and the story of motherhood and daughterhood, and what it means to be displaced, and how the connection between mother and daughter kind of stays through the different stages of displacement. And the visual artist is really cool and has these, has depicted kind of almost like a futuristic, like a fantasy kind of land. So it's, I think, unclear sometimes whether the connection is actually an imagination of a potential relationship or a desired relationship, which, we all know could be very complicated between mothers and daughters, especially in moments of trauma or war. So I think it's a very nuanced text about the idea, because I think it also could be applied to anyone, and so it's kind of this universal story about movements with mothers and daughters.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, can you say the name of that book again?
Oh yeah, it's called just Zabel Yesayan and her daughter. Yeah.
Okay.
I can give you.
If I were to recommend like a comic, I'm like Qiana, I think Bitterroot is a great comic, which is a comic set in the 1920s in Harlem, and it's an independent Black drawn, Black written comic that has essays in the back. So it's kind of, it's a very complicated, and it's really reflective of a certain set of things. And that's a great comic that I would recommend. I appreciate you guys humoring me with this roundtable. I know it's a little stressful to be put on the spot, but I also think that one of the things about this, the work of sort of like teaching this stuff, that it's often at the center of a number of conversations. Some of those conversations are often, at least in the hands of observers, distorting what's going on. And I think one of the things that, if you're thinking about this material on a daily basis, what you're trying to do is actually build understanding, not create division as it's sometimes being painted. And so it's always great to give a chance to sort of like slow down and ask people about the implications of this work. I appreciate everyone's being here all day, if you've been here all day in person or been here all day online. But we're coming to the end of the day, and I know that Scott French has a few final words. Scott French has no final word. Oh. Scott French is so tired. He has no final word. What we're going to do is ask you to, this is the first day. Hopefully you enjoyed day one, as a way of thanking all our presenters, whether they're in person or online. Let's give them a round of applause. I'd like to thank UCF, of course, for being the host, UCF Downtown, and thank Dean Brody, thank the Center for Humanities and Digital Research for being partners in our organization. Of course, we also have to thank the Associated Preserve Edenville community, the organization behind us, the Hurston Festival, for supporting our ongoing conversation around Afrofuturism. This is day one, but of course, day two, we are coming back with even more Afrofuturism, even more exploration of the visual realm if you like this day, you'll like tomorrow even more, right? So you have to come back and tell your friends. Of course, if you missed anything, one of the great benefits of this program and the support of UCF is that everything is being recorded and it can be found online almost immediately. So again, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much to our presenters, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, bye, online people, bye.